You want to know something that breaks every rule of psychology textbooks? There's a specific type of person who literally cannot feel empathy while simultaneously being brilliant at faking it. And what's even more unsettling? These people don't accidentally end up in positions of extreme wealth and influence. They're designed to get there. For decades, one man used a private Caribbean island as his personal kingdom, hiding in plain sight among presidents, celebrities, and royalty. The question we're about to answer isn't just what happened there, it's why, and more importantly, how someone's brain can be wired so differently from ours that they see human beings as nothing more than possessions to collect and discard. This is the psychology of evil, and it's a lot more scientific and more common than you'd ever want to admit. Here's where it starts to get strange. Jeffrey Epstein's childhood was almost normal. His father was a groundskeeper in New York City. His mother worked as a school aide. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, not in a mansion. His former schoolmates described him as a quiet nerd who was good at math. So what happened? Something shifted. By the time Epstein hit his late 20s, he'd landed a job teaching math to privileged kids at an elite preparatory school in Manhattan. And teachers noticed something odd. He was paying unusual attention to his underage female students. But here's the crucial part. He was charming about it. Nobody reported it because he made it seem normal. This is where psychology gets dark. Epstein wasn't stumbling into his predatory behavior. He was testing boundaries. Psychologists call this incremental boundary violation. You start small, see what people will tolerate, and then you push a little further and further and further. By the time he'd moved into finance, making his first fortune through Wall Street connections, something critical had changed in how he operated. He discovered that wealth and charm were invincible combinations, that if you had enough money, the rules that applied to everyone else simply stopped existing. The island came later, but it wasn't an accident. It was the logical endpoint of a philosophy that had been building for decades. I can do anything if I never face consequences. Here's what modern psychology knows. There are 3 overlapping personality traits that exist together in people who cause deliberate, calculated harm. Researchers call it the Dark Triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Most people hear psychopath and imagine a violent killer. That's dangerously wrong. True psychopathy is defined by emotional poverty combined with superficial charm. A real psychopath feels almost nothing, no guilt, no remorse, no genuine empathy, but is brilliant at mimicking emotions they've observed in others. They're like method actors who never stop performing. Narcissism adds a layer, an unquenchable need to be admired, to be superior, to have everyone acknowledge their specialness. And then there's Machiavellianism, the strategic, calculated manipulation. These individuals view other people as chess pieces. They plan years in advance. They're patient. They understand power dynamics better than most politicians. Epstein displayed all 3, but here's what made him particularly dangerous. He had the wealth to build an entire ecosystem that reinforced his behavior. When you're rich enough, people around you start to enable your worst impulses. Your assistants don't ask questions. Your connections provide cover. Your lawyers disappear problems. The island wasn't just a physical location. It was a psychological sanctuary where normal rules genuinely didn't apply because nobody could touch him there. And that's when something even more sinister happens. He stops seeing his behavior as wrong at all. In his own mind, he wasn't a predator. He was simply a man who could afford to get what he wanted. The victims weren't humans with rights. They were resources he'd purchased. But the island itself was never just about privacy. It was psychological architecture. Imagine you're a vulnerable teenager who's been trafficked there. You arrive on a private plane with no phone signal. The island is isolated. Everyone around you is a staff member or another victim. And towering above it all is this figure, Epstein, who has unlimited resources, zero accountability, and a home where he owns every single person present. This is called a control environment, and it's been used throughout history by people who want to warp reality for captive individuals. It's how cults operate. It's how human trafficking networks function. The victims are isolated so completely that they can't even access objective reality anymore. They lose their sense of what's normal. Worse, Epstein and his network used a tactic called grooming. It works like this. You create a sense of specialness and privilege in your victim. You make them feel chosen. You give them gifts and attention. You make them feel like part of an exclusive club. And then, once they're emotionally invested and trust has been established, the exploitation begins. Psychologists have studied this pattern for decades. It shows up in abusive relationships, in cult situations, in human trafficking. And it's devastatingly effective because it hijacks the victim's own psychology, their need to feel valued, their desire for belonging, their trust in authority figures. The island magnified this 1,000 times over. It was a temple built to Epstein's narcissism, where his delusions of invincibility became self-fulfilling prophecies because nobody ever told him no. Here's what keeps psychologists awake at night. Epstein didn't operate alone, and he wasn't a secret. For years, rumors circulated among the wealthy elite. People in his circle knew. Some women had come forward to law enforcement starting in 2005. Investigators had gathered evidence. And yet, for over a decade, he faced almost no real consequences. Why? Because Epstein had something more valuable than the island itself. He had a network. He had photos, recordings, and documented evidence of powerful people at his properties, and everyone knew it. This created a psychological phenomenon called mutual assured destruction. If you expose me, I expose you. So powerful men protected him. Think about how warped this becomes. You have a system where the consequences for speaking up are worse than the consequences of silence. That's when psychological corruption spreads beyond one individual and becomes systemic. It stops being Epstein's pathology and becomes everyone's choice. It took decades and a dedicated investigative journalist in 2018 to finally crack the silence open. Only then did a new federal case get filed. Only then did he face real accountability. And even in that moment, in 2019, facing life in prison, something deeply suspicious happened. He died in jail under circumstances that still don't add up. Whether it was suicide or not, his death was the perfect ending to his story. Even his final act maintains mystery and prevents justice for victims who never got their day in full court. So, what's the real lesson here? The psychology of evil isn't about monsters in the shadows. It's about how wealth, narcissism, and the absence of consequences can transform ordinary human pathology into systematic harm that destroys lives. It's a reminder that people with no empathy exist in our world. They're charming, they're intelligent, And if we're not paying attention, they end up running institutions, building networks, and creating private islands where their worst impulses become reality. The unsettling part? Epstein is just one example. Forensic psychologists estimate that people displaying these Dark Triad traits exist at all levels of society, wherever power and opportunity intersect. If you want to understand how the world actually works, not the version we tell ourselves, but how it really operates, you need to understand the psychology of power, corruption, and the people who see human beings as collateral. That's the conversation we need to keep having. We've got more deep dives into criminal psychology and the hidden forces that shape our world coming up. Subscribe so you don't miss when we break down the next one. Thanks for watching. Stay aware.